The Drum Candy Podcast is brought to you by Drum Factory Direct.
What's up, everyone? Welcome into episode 17 of season 2 of the Drum Candy Podcast. This is your host, Mike Dawson, coming to you from Drum Factory Direct in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I hope you all had a good holiday season. Happy New Year to everyone. Thank you for your patience while we took a couple weeks off to regroup. I have a bunch of new ideas coming for the show, maybe for season 3, but we're going to wrap up season 2 with a couple special episodes. And this week, I've got my good friend Paul Wells on. Paul Wells is a New York City-based jazz drummer and educator. He teaches over at Juilliard. He tours internationally with Kurt Stigers. He's a member of Vince Giordano's Nighthawks. He's also performed or recorded with Deborah Harry, Joe Williams, the Vanguard Jazz Orchestra, Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra, and Kristen Chenoweth. But most importantly, Paul is a Neil Peart freak. So this week we are going to dig in on, it's supposed to have been 6, but we added a couple extra, 6+ of Paul's favorite tracks from the middle period of Neil Peart's tenure with the band Rush. We've got a lot of music to listen to. We've got a lot of gear to talk about, and let's just get to it. So see you at the end.
Well, Paul, thanks for coming on to the show. I was trying to think back when we first met. It must have been 2006 or 7. I don't think you had moved to New York City full time yet. I think you were in Pennsylvania.
No, I had lived in New York previous, but had been in Pennsylvania at that time that we met and moved back to New York in 2012.
Okay. And I think you were either just about to hit the road with Deborah Harry or just come off the road with Deborah Harry. I can't quite remember.
Yeah, that tour was 2007. That was like the fall of 2007 that I toured with her.
Okay, right on. So I want to start with kind of the transition from being a prog drummer or whatever you want to call it, a rock drummer, to then pursuing a career in jazz. Like, how does that transition happen?
I mean, really, it's all about, for me, I mean, I'm just a fan of all of these different kinds of music. And I you know, when I get into something, I go pretty hard. And I just want to learn everything I can about a style or a genre or a certain player or, any number of things. So it really comes from just love of all of those styles of music. And I had actually started as a drummer all through the time growing up in Pittsburgh. I didn't think about those genres as being something that were, you could only do one. I just was into all kinds of things and wanted to play all kinds of things. And in a smaller music scene like Pittsburgh, you could do that. And there are still drummers there, like our buddy David Throckmorton, who plays all kinds of stuff from bebop to pretty slamming rock. In New York, there's less opportunity to do so, but I went to school for jazz. I went to William Patterson outside of New York City and had been a jazz drummer in New York all through the 90s and then really got the bug. Actually, it was a Rush concert that really kind of made me, it was in June of 97, going to see them. It was on the Test for Echo tour. It was the 6th concert on that tour that I saw of them. And something about, I know, something about that show, I was very, very close to the stage, and something about the atmosphere and seeing Neil play, and something, it just hit me like, I need to do this. I need to play rock right now, basically. And, I had done it a lot in high school and before that, but I then really kind of switched gears and started, shedding and looking for opportunities to play that kind of music on a professional level. And so that's what led to me being in the band Spiraling for a number of years, which led to the Debbie Harry gig. But it was after that I kind of made the transition back into being a full-time jazz drummer. And I still occasionally get called to do some backbeat stuff, but mostly it's jazz. But It's really all about just total love for those styles.
So I've had some friends of mine mention, like, to be a jazz musician, it's a lifestyle choice. Like, you can't dabble in being a jazz musician.
I wouldn't say it's a lifestyle. It's a life pursuit for sure. But lifestyle is whatever you choose your lifestyle to be. It's, that's what it is. I don't think you need to subscribe to any sort of, same thing with rock. I mean, actually Neil is a great example of somebody who was a rock musician, but did not lead a rock and roll lifestyle at all.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. But but I know what you mean. I mean, it is a lifetime pursuit. And I do think that in a way, spending 8 years or so or whatever it was, focusing primarily on rock. I was still playing jazz gigs, but it wasn't really my focus, and it wasn't something that I spent a lot of time practicing. And I do think my playing suffered for that, my jazz playing. But and I'm still in some ways playing catch up, and it's hopefully stuff that no one but me would really notice. But it's, there's certain technical things that I feel like if I'd continued on that path from college on without that detour, maybe I'd be stronger. But I also learned a lot of things musically about groove and tempo and time and things like that I don't know, that those things that I learned from being a rock player that I think have helped my jazz playing considerably, that maybe I wouldn't have gotten any other way.
So you mentioned you saw Rush 6 times on that tour, so that must qualify
on that
you
tour
as a super fan. So what is your
I think so.
connection to Rush and Neil Peart? How did that come about?
Well, I had heard about him, or I had sort of been aware somehow as a kid. I think I'd seen him. My dad got MTV around 1982 or 83. And I just basically planted myself in front of the TV and did nothing but watch MTV for a number of years. And, so I know all of that music, pop, rock, and even the tiny little bit of, actually, God, there wasn't really any hip hop other than Walk This Way at that point on MTV. But all of that music that was playing at the time, I know. And I remember Rush. I remember this guy sitting behind a giant red drum set and sort of thinking like, oh, that's intriguing. When I was 10, I started taking my first drum lessons at Swissvale Music Store in Pittsburgh. And I remember at my very first drum lesson, or maybe it was when I signed up, my father took me there and he bought me my first copy of Modern Drummer ever. And it happened to be, and I have an example here. I have a prop. It happened to be the April 1984 issue.
Wow.
With our buddy on the cover here. And this was like, oh, okay, this is pretty cool. This guy's got a lot of drums. This looks like pretty fun stuff. And there's some amazing photos in here of Neil playing the giant kid. And, but I still hadn't really heard them. Actually, that issue I just showed you is a one I bought on eBay somewhat more recently. I actually still have the exact copy that I got in February or March of 84. And as you can see, it's just completely in pieces, but I do still have my, yeah.
Did you cut the photos out? That's what I did. I
didn't. No, I didn't. But I used to take this in my backpack to school every day. And in these days, Modern Drummer was just stapled together. It wasn't bound. So the pages would just fall apart and fall out. So I still have all the pages.
Amazing.
Yeah. But this is the original copy that my dad bought me in 84. And I still hadn't heard them really or paid attention. So but what happened was, in the summer of 86, I went to a jazz camp for the first time. I went to the International Music Camp. My parents were from Winnipeg, and we would go to Winnipeg every summer to visit. And on the Manitoba-North Dakota border was the International Music Camp was held every summer. And I went for the jazz week. And the teacher, I went to that for a number of years. It was actually a great experience. It was really my first experience learning about jazz. But also the drum teacher the first year, and I forget the guy's name the first year. The second and third year was a great teacher named Scott Prebis, and then Dave Mancini taught me there later. But the first year was a different guy, and I forget his name, but he took all the drum students outside. It was a beautiful, like, July day, sat us in sort of a semicircle, and he sat in front of us with a boom box, and he played us a tape of Exit Stage Left, and he played us Neil's drum solo on YYZ. And that was the first time I had heard anything like that. It completely blew my mind. It was just like the coolest thing I'd ever heard. And that was the first time I heard him. And I very quickly started buying the records as soon as I got home. And yeah, so that was where I first got into them. And I first saw them, the first concert I went to was with our mutual friend, the great bassist Paul Thompson. And we went to see them at the Civic Arena in Pittsburgh in December. I think it was December 16th, 1987 on the Hold Your Fire tour. And we were just both completely freaking out, you know.
So, I mean, were you
when
listening?
did you see them? When did you first see them?
I never saw them. I didn't.
You never
get
saw
into
them? Oh.
It was Presto was the record that came out when I first started playing drums.
Yeah,
it was the same thing. MTV, didn't know what it was, but the drums were so loud and present, and it related to, because I was a big fan of Yes, Owner of a Lonely Heart, and that record kind of reminded me of that sound. So yeah, I kind of just found them via MTV, like a lot of us in our generation, just a few years later, but never got to see them.
That's why those bands put videos on MTV. I mean, that's like the process in action, you know, successfully working. Like, oh, who's this? I like this. I'll buy this record. I'll go see this band.
Yeah.
That's how it worked.
So did you go through a phase of trying to set up as many drums as possible to do the Rush thing?
Dude, I did that just recently. But yeah, I did. I mean, I got, you know, not long after that summer camp, I got my first, I had a Remo PTS kit before that, a little 5-piece, not a particularly good drum set, but soon after that camp, my mom actually bought me a Pearl Export 9-piece kit, wine red. And yeah, so that was like, you know, 4 rack toms, 2 floor toms, 2 bass drums, snare drum. And I definitely, you know, I mean, I just set it up, and I was trying to learn to play those parts and trying to learn to play, you know, play the parts from Moving Pictures and Hemispheres and all that stuff. And yeah, that continued through high school. I would go through phases though. I would, like, for a while I'd be into Neil and I'd set up like him, but then maybe like a month later I would be listening to Steve Gadd or Dave Weckl and I'd want to set up like those guys. But sometimes I remember playing on, like, having my drum set up like Steve Gadd, same kit, but having the 10, 12 and then the 13 and the 14 as floor toms and, like, you know, a ride and a couple of crashes. But I remember playing Rush stuff on that setup too and trying to adapt it for that. So yeah, I did every imaginable variation.
That's amazing. I feel like Rush, for some folks, they're a transitional band to get into more quote unquote complicated music. And then a lot of times it does lead to jazz, which ironically is a more stripped down approach to the instrument in a lot of ways. But you seem to have kept the same passion for Neil the whole time. It wasn't like a gateway for you. Yeah. Like, what is he bringing to you?
I mean, all through college, when I was just completely, you know, in depth studying jazz, studying with John Riley at the time and learning, you know, Thad Jones, Mel Lewis, big band charts, and just getting really deep into that. I was still going to see Rush. I was still buying every album the day it came out. I was still going to see them every chance I could. I've never really been able to shake it. I just love the stuff. And it grew from being just about Neil and about the drumming into being, you know, loving Geddy and Alex too, and loving the songwriting and the arranging. And in a way, that's more what I'm into now. I think that they are heavily underrated as songwriters. I think that Geddy in particular has written some absolutely gorgeous melodies, wonderful vocal melodies, the arranging, the different styles of production and arranging that they've gone through from like the 80s with lots of synths and lots of like very orchestral sort of literally orchestral, because they did record with an orchestra on a number of occasions, to very stripped down approaches at different times. And I just love all of it. And I think it's just fantastic music. I think Alex is an amazing guitar player. Again, really underrated, plays some beautiful solos. And there's just a lot of energy. There's an energy that I love. It's just a lot of forward motion, very punchy, to use the parlance of the times. It really pops, you know, everything is really like, it just has a lot of, just energy. I run to Rush. My favorite, running playlist. I run just about every other day, and it's usually to Rush. It's usually to a playlist of Rush. So, you know, it's still very much in my life.
Is there any direct or indirect influences that you hear from Neil on your jazz gigs?
Not really. Nothing. I mean, very vaguely. I mean, just, you know, well, certainly like attention to detail, attention to sound. I'll get into this maybe later, but you know, if you listen to these records, he actually tunes his toms very, very, very high. There's actually like some of his drums are almost kind of tuned in like a bebop range. So there is maybe a sort of a connection sound wise. But where it actually comes in, and I was actually just discussing this with a student yesterday, because I was talking to my student about this podcast, about doing this talk about Neil, and he said, "Oh, we should do a lesson talking about Neil." And I said, "Well, I don't know how relevant it is to you studying jazz here at Juilliard, but actually, you know, let's talk about orchestration. Let's talk about like." You know, and I played him a couple of tunes where Neil is very clearly coming up with like, okay, this is a part for this verse, and then here's the chorus. Now we get to verse 2, it's going to be similar to verse 1, but more. And here's chorus 2, it's going to be similar to chorus 1, but a little bigger, or a little different orchestration of the same part, that kind of thing. And then I played him some big band music. I played him some the Vanguard Jazz Orchestra playing Jim McNeely music. And I showed him how when I play those tunes, when I get to sub with the Vanguard Jazz Orchestra, that I take a similar approach in a way of, okay, here's the A, I'm going to do it on this cymbal, and it's going to be sparse. And then we get to the B section, I'm going to change the texture. I'm going to give it a little more. And then we go back to A, but it's not the same energy as the first A. So it's going to be like this, but a little more. It's the same general approach. It's, you know, obviously a different aesthetic, but the approach is the same. And maybe Neil was the first place that I really noticed people doing it. He's certainly not the first or last person to play drums like that, but it may very likely be the first time that I paid attention to anybody doing that. So that might be the connection.
Well, let's dive into some tracks. So we're focusing on the what would you call it? The middle era of Rush's catalog.
I guess so. I mean, yeah, maybe I mean, you have like the very early stuff. You have like, you know, Farewell to Kings, Hemispheres, the sort of proggier stuff. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think of this as sort of an underlooked period, but we are going to start with Exit Stage Left, because I want to talk about the drum solo and how, I mean, that was the first thing that I heard, and I still think it's just a fantastic drum solo in many, many ways. So let's check that out.
All right.
So, one of the things I love about this, and maybe this is coming from my jazz musician ears, but he didn't do this a lot over the course of the various tours, where the solo comes in the middle of a tune, and is bookended by the beginning and the first half and the second half of the tune. And I feel like he's playing the tune through the whole solo. And what I mean by that is the whole thing is in tempo. The whole thing is in time. It's in the same tempo as the tune. The only part where he deviates is when he starts doing the thing. I don't know what people call it now. That we used to call them quads for some reason. When you do right, left with the hands, right, left with the feet. You know what I'm talking about at the end.
Oh yeah.
Now he starts that out. He starts it out at a slower tempo, but he eventually brings it up to speed where it's the same tempo as the tune. And I feel like what he's playing is all in the same. If this is really maybe going to be a stretch to refer to it as a clave, but it's all within the clave of the tune. It's all in the same sort of rhythmic language, which is basically just 16th notes, right? It's just this. It's a tune with a pulse and a lot of 16th notes, and sort of like some syncopated 16th notes. But that's what the whole solo is, and I love that it maintains the energy of the tune through the whole thing, and sort of brings it to another level. I just think that's super cool. And to talk about this solo, to get really in the weeds about it, I have a lot of bootlegs of Rush, and particularly of this tour, because I think that this tour was probably, for me personally, even though I mentioned I love the records that come after this so much, I think in a way maybe live this was maybe their zenith as a live band, and particularly the end of this tour. They were playing so unbelievably well on this tour. And what's interesting is, so I have the dates. This tour, the Moving Pictures tour, started, sorry, I should have this handy. It started on February 20th, 1981. And it ended on July 5th, 1981. So not that long a tour by their standards. So this solo, so they recorded a bunch of shows in Canada for the Exit Stage Left record, which the Exit Stage Left is mostly made up of stuff from the Moving Pictures tour. And they recorded Toronto and Montreal shows in the end of March of 81. So that's towards the beginning of the tour. And then they also recorded Vancouver and Edmonton at the end of June. So towards the end of the tour. And most of this solo is taken from, it's either the Vancouver or Edmonton show. It's later in the tour. But what I think very few people know is that there's an edit in this solo. There's at least one. I actually hear a second one, but I won't get into that. At 4 minutes, 57 seconds. So I think the entire solo is from later in the tour until you get to 4 minutes, 57 seconds. That's right after he plays the stuff on the gong bass drums. There's an edit, and suddenly we are in the March 25th show from Toronto. And that's what finishes the solo. Because the reason I know this is there is a bootleg of the entire March 25th show from Toronto. You can probably find it on YouTube. Most of these bootlegs are on YouTube now. It used to be that you'd have to find them at record shows or you'd trade amongst other collectors on the internet. But I have a bootleg, and you can probably find it. Listeners can probably find it out there from March 25th, and you will hear it's a completely different solo, but then at a certain point, suddenly it's the Exit Stage Left solo near the end. Yeah. So, and that may be because they had a problem with the Vancouver or Edmonton show. Maybe something happened and that, the tape ran out, or any number of technical problems maybe that led to them not being able to use the end of that solo and had to splice in a different solo. Or maybe they just like the end of that solo better. I don't know. But the reason I bring this up is because the solo really changed over the course of that tour. And if you want to hear, so on this version towards the end of the tour, he starts out with all this sort of quasi rudimental snare drum stuff, right? And then he goes into the hi-hat, like, you know, the Bernard Purdie sort of psst, psst, psst stuff. And that's how he was playing the solo towards the end of the tour. If you listen to recordings from the beginning of the tour, he started the solo out in a completely different way, and it's really interesting to compare those. And there is actually an official release now. I happen to have it here. The Moving Pictures box set that came out this year has they released with this box set the entire show from one of the different shows in Toronto. I think they released one of the March shows in Toronto.
Oh, cool.
The complete, you know, it's sort of an exit, like an alternate exit stage left. So you can hear now, you can check this out on Spotify, or you can buy the LP or the CD or whatever, you know, however you get your music. But you can check out an earlier solo from that tour, and you can hear how different it is and how much the solo evolved over the course of, you know, whatever that is, a 4-month tour. So that's stuff that's interesting about that solo to me.
What I heard,
I've listened to that solo, I mean, thousands of times probably at this point.
I heard a strong like swing connection that I might not have noticed before, like a lot of Gene Krupa kind of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, that's just sort of that syncopated. I mean, it's either, you know, I think of the tune as 1, 2, 3, 4, so those would be 16th notes. But you could also think of it double time, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and they'd be 8th notes. But it is syncopated. You know, I mean, that comes from like 1920s style drumming, really. It sort of goes back to like parade style drumming in New Orleans that drummers like, well, definitely Gene Krupa and earlier drummers like Zutty Singleton and people like that were playing. You know, it's sort of a, you know, I don't know how much Neil. I don't really hear those 8th notes as having any sort of swing in them, but maybe there's a touch. I don't know. Do you hear that, or is it more in the syncopated nature?
Yeah, more just the nature.
Playing?
The kick drum on all 4 and the toms over top, and then the cowbells. It sounded like early swing music to me in a way. Yeah.
Well, he grew up listening to, you know, his dad was into the big band, so he grew up hearing Gene Krupa and Ellington and Basie and bands like that. So he must have had that. I mean, he talked about that at times in interviews, but I think he definitely had a connection to that and had some of that sort of phrasing in his ears.
Let's go on to the next tune, The Weapon.
Yeah.
So this is off of Signals.
Yeah, 1982.
And you've highlighted the first minute and then from
the
540 outro to the end. So let's start at the beginning. And then jumping to 540. I have to admit, I do not know this record at all.
Signals? Oh, no. It's brilliant. It's really brilliant. It's an amazing record because Moving Pictures was Moving Pictures was a huge breakthrough for them. And it was one of those records that would be hard for any band to follow up. And Signals is just like, okay, here's the next step for us. It's almost like it doesn't sound like they were intimidated by the idea that they just had this huge record. They just made the record they wanted to make, and it's very different. And it doesn't, I don't feel like they're trying to capture anything. They're not just thinking like, oh, we need to capture the magic of the last one. They just made a record, and it's brilliant. But I do think that this is where you start to get into them writing more concise tunes, more sort of, I guess, more melodic, prettier melodies, more emphasis on writing songs that the vocal melody maybe would have been more of a priority than other things. This tune is interesting because I think this is the first time you find a Rush song where you have a 4-on-the-floor bass drum throughout the entire tune. And there's some other ones later on, but this is when they were starting to listen to a lot of new wave. And Neil talked about being into bands like Japan. God, I forget the name of the drummer, great band with a lot of like, there's a dance influence, but also this sort of like, a lot of tom-tom rhythms, a lot of like sort of, potentially maybe influenced by West African music sort of grooves. And they were listening to Ultravox, and obviously there's a big influence of the Police, which dates back previous records from this even. But so it's 4-on-the-floor bass drum, but it almost sounds like, okay, let's figure out a way to do 4-on-the-floor bass drum and everything that brings to a tune, but let's also combine it with a really offbeat, syncopated, weird rhythm on top of it. So he starts out playing on the hi-hat and playing a part. It sounds a little improvised, but it's actually groups of 3 that sort of repeat. And then when they get into the main verse groove, that's a really awkward sounding beat. And the way that he plays it is he actually plays with his left hand on the hi-hat and his right hand on the snare drum. So he's like, sorry, I should do this. And apparently that rhythm came from Geddy Lee's original demo, where he wrote it at home and actually used a Roland 808 drum machine, of all things, to program this goofy rhythm with this 4-on-the-floor pulse, but then this crazy syncopated thing on top. And Neil basically had to replicate that because they kind of all felt that it just worked for the tune. And so that's where that beat came from. And then the outro, I thought it'd be interesting to listen to that because it's just kind of an interesting thing. The 4-on-the-floor pulse continues, and then he's playing these really interesting sort of tom, maybe influenced by the band Japan, but this sort of really syncopated tom rhythms going up and down the 8 tom-toms that he had at the time, and very over the bar line kind of stuff. It doesn't fit into a nice square, like 2-bar phrase, 4-bar phrase kind of thing. It's really kind of, those things just sort of land wherever they land. And I just think it's also one of the first examples maybe of him playing like that, where he's not just hitting a bunch of downbeats, fill, downbeat, fill, downbeat. It kind of goes over the 4-bar or 2-bar structure. So I think that is interesting too. Also, the sound of the drums on this is fantastic. This is when he first got the Tama Art Star prototypes, which were a thinner shell than he'd been using before. It was a 4-ply shell of birch, and the drums just sound more open than to my ears anyway. They kind of bloom more. Each tom-tom blooms more. Also, going back to the intro, it starts with just him. And if anybody wants to know what a 14 by 24 inch bass drum sounds like, this is exactly what that bass drum sounds like. This is like, you're not here. It's not heavily processed. It just sounds like a 14 by 24 in a room, played hard, with like, a hole in the front head. That's just, it's like the perfect example of what does that drum sound like? What does that size sound like?
All right. Next up, Red
now,
Lenses.
Before we start, the reason that I wanted to the reason I picked this song is because I think that this may be the hardest thing that Neil ever played. If we're just talking about pure, not even technical skill, but coordination around the kit, people talk about La Via Strangiato or YYZ or tunes like that as being like, oh, these are like biggest drumming challenges. Yeah, those are hard tunes, but seriously, try to play Red Lenses. I dare you. And when I say that, you have to play it on Neil's kit. Neil's exact setup. So this is from '84, Grace Under Pressure record. This is when he added the back kit. He called it the satellite kit. So behind him, he added a second kit, the bass drum, snare drum, ride, hi-hat, cymbals, and at the time, 4 Simmons toms. So he'd turn around and he'd have this whole other kit behind him. But what was cool about this setup is that he could still hit a lot of the other stuff in his front kit. It just was on opposite sides. So instead of the concert toms being up here and the ride cymbal being over here, he turns around, he's on the back kit, and now there's concert toms up to his right, and there's a second ride cymbal and Chinese cymbal to his left. So he utilizes all of this. So this is basically the pattern that happens in, I don't know if you'd say it's the chorus of the tune or the B section of the tune, but let's listen to it.
Okay.
I see red. That's my head. I guess it must be something that I It's the color of your heartbeat, a rising summer sun, about to last all the flash to fashion, the pulse to fashion feels red.
The rhythm isn't complicated. So what makes it the most challenging thing?
Dude. Okay, you have to understand his setup. Now, I can show you on my iPad. I can either show you a picture of this or I can do a screen share. What would you prefer?
Just show me the picture. Let's go that way first.
So this is from a little bit later. This is a picture from 1990 on the Presto tour. Trying to center this as best I can. Mm-hmm. So this is one of the best overhead shots showing Neil is sitting at the front of the kit. The back kit is there. You can see he's kind of obscuring the second bass drum. He had an 18-inch bass drum back there, but you can see the Simmons toms. You can see the hi-hat, and you can also see how he's right next to the gong bass drum here.
Yep.
He's got the smaller tom toms above the marimba there. So also, if you notice, it's hard to see here, but at the front of the kit, there's a splash cymbal and the cowbells are over here. Mm-hmm. So if you're sitting facing the electronic kit, the cowbells are practically behind you. Mm-hmm. And then also on your right, you've got these little tom-toms. So when he plays that rhythm, he plays the first part of the rhythm on the gong bass drum and the low tom on the electronic kit. Boom, boom. And then he plays some notes on the snare. Now, one thing to point out, he turns, as if this wasn't hard enough, he's turning the snares on and off on the back kit. So he's got the snares on for the verse when he's playing a straight ahead sort of rock beat there at the beginning. And then he turns them off for this B section and then turns them back on before the rock beat comes back in. I'm not even sure he has like a second to turn them on. So he plays some notes on the snare, and then he hits 2 notes on the highest concert tom, which is on his right now. Mm-hmm. It's over on this side. Okay, so imagine that he's playing do do gat gat. So this is the toms, the snare, and then the concert tom up here. This is the beginning. Do do gat gat ga doom doom do 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 on a tom, on a Simmons tom.
Yeah.
Do do gat gat ga doom doom do do do. Okay, that's the first half. Then the second half, the low toms again, do do gat gat, same rhythm on the snare. But then he basically turns almost completely around to play those cowbells. Do do gat gat do do, whatever it is on the cowbells. And then the next two notes after the cowbells is the second concert tom, which is like basically over here. And then he hits three notes on the highest Simmons tom again. So again, to actually visualize it, the second half of that rhythm, do 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 go 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 do do do, or I think it's with the left hand, but yeah, do 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 do. It requires like such an incredible stretch, and I guess it helps to understand physically Neil's stature. Neil was extremely tall. Neil was about at least 6'4", maybe a little taller. When I met him, I mean, he just towered over me. He was a very tall guy, and I think he had a really long reach on his kit where he could, make these ridiculous stretches. Also, when he hits the 8-inch concert tom in the second half of that, he's also hitting a left foot trigger, an electronic sound, which triggers a Simmons clap trap, which is a sort of clap sound, like a kind of sound that you hear a lot actually starting in, that was a device he utilized a lot in Grace Under Pressure, Power Windows, Hold Your Fire. You hear this clap sound. Anytime you hear that, that's a left foot trigger. He had one on the back kit and he had one on the main kit, right to the left of his hi-hat pedal. And he would, I'm going to talk about this in the next tune, actually, in Lock and Key. You hear him taking his left foot off the hi-hat and hitting this trigger to make the clap sound. So while he's doing all of that and reaching over to hit this concert tom, he hits the left foot trigger. And then
that's so bad for your spine.
Yeah, I know. So unfortunately, there's really no good video of him playing this tune. They only played it on the Grace Under Pressure tour. And there is a professionally shot video from that tour, but they didn't include the tune Red Lenses, which is tragic. But there is a bootleg from Osaka from, November 21st, 1984. If you search on YouTube, Red Lenses, I think if you just search for Red Lenses, you'll find it. It'll be one of the first things that comes up. It's a really fuzzy, shaky camcorder footage of them playing this tune, but you can see him. It does actually focus on him a bit during this section of the tune, and you can see him stretching like that, but he pulls it off. It is completely in the pocket. Like if you listen to the recording, he's playing that live on the recording, and there's nothing's off the grid. I mean, he's able to play that super consistently. And every bootleg I've heard of them doing this tune, he just plays that part like it's nothing. He plays it as though he's just playing, like on an octopad or something, where he doesn't have to stretch at all. So not only did he have that sort of coordination and independence, but a really great sense of time by this point, where everything is right on the grid and everything is just extremely consistent. All the dynamics, there's no note that's like a little too soft because he's reaching so far to hit it. You know what I mean? So I really think this is one of the most challenging things that he ever wrote and played ever in the entire, however many studio records, 15 or whatever there are. I challenge you to find something trickier to play than this.
All right. You mentioned
why I included it.
Before we started recording that you got to meet him. Did you happen to get behind his kit?
No, it wasn't at a concert. Well, it was a concert, but not one he was playing at. It was one of the Buddy Rich Memorial Scholarship concerts in New York. There was one in 94 that he gave a speech at, but he didn't play drum kit. He didn't play with the band. He did play percussion on a tune, on the encore. They did Pick Up the Pieces, and he played some like congas and stuff, but he didn't play kit with the band at this one. But he was giving a speech, and I got to go because I was studying with John Riley at the time at William Patterson, and I was hanging with John at the concert. And before the concert, John basically said, "Hey, let's go backstage and say hi to the cats." And I was like, okay. So there was no security. There was nobody. There were no backstage passes. We just walked backstage, and Weckl was there, and Omar Hakim, and all these heavyweights, and Neil was there, and I really wanted to meet him. And at first, I did the absolute wrong thing. I went up to him and started sort of gushing, and he was just, anybody who knows about Neil knows he was not receptive to gushy fan advances. But then at a later point, I approached him again and started asking him questions about his experiences traveling, particularly in Africa, because I was kind of interested in that at the time. And he was actually really, really friendly and really chatty. And we had about a 15-minute conversation. And we actually ended up talking about drumming and talking about Rush and stuff that they were doing. But it kind of led to that more organically. But I also did get this. He signed my Counterpart CD.
Oh, nice.
Which was their current release at the time. Yeah, it was really fun to get to meet him. Really, really cool to get to talk to him.
Very cool. Let's move on to the next tune, Lock and Key.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've highlighted the beginning to the first 50 seconds, and then the final.
The beginning, I put just because, well, two things. The intro fill. There's a synth intro, and the fill that he plays to bring in the tune is just completely ridiculous. And then when he starts playing the intro on the kit, you'll hear him play some fills on the toms. And check out the tuning of the first tom that you hear. The first tom that he plays, like the first fill on, is his 8x12-inch rack tom. And just check out how incredibly high it's tuned. And other than like Max Roach and Kenny Washington and Greg Hutchinson, guys like that, like, tell me who tunes a 12-inch tom this high besides Neil. It's a very, very unique thing that he does.
All right, here's the first 50 seconds. All right, and then jumping to...
Yeah, so there's two things to check out in this at the end of the tune. There's like a little sort of breakdown before the outro, and this is where you can hear him going off of the left foot hi-hat to play this sort of left foot trigger, playing the clap sound. And then after that, we go into, there's a brief sort of recapitulation of the chorus without vocals, and then we go back to the intro, but instead of it just being a synth intro, he actually plays a solo over the intro, which is really cool. It's sort of a drum solo within a tune with the band sort of accompanying his solo. And it's interesting because it's all of the hits that he's playing around. Again, this, maybe you'll hear this as almost slightly jazz influenced. Everything is offbeats. All the hits are offbeats. It's there aren't like strong downbeat hits, and everything is orchestrated towards those offbeats. So check that out.
All right, here we go.
We don't want to be victims, on that we all agree. So we lock up the killer instinct and throw away the key.
Yeah.
It's also a king of the fade out, throwing a little something in there for you.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there are a lot of tunes with fade outs that they're it's actually kind of fun to if you put like a tune like that into a DAW and increase the volume at the fade out so that you can actually hear what they're doing at the fade outs. There's sometimes some really cool stuff at the fade outs of Rush tunes.
I never thought to do that. It's a great idea.
Well, if you have the time.
This right away was like, that's the sound that I remember Rush capturing my ear. Just so clean and precise.
Yeah.
His drum sound. Yeah. The tuning is something I never really thought about either. It's really up there. I mean, it's way up there.
It is. It is. And in that solo outro, the highest tom you hear is the 12, and it's tuned, definitely in a 10-inch tom range, what most people would consider a 10-inch tom range, maybe even higher. I mean, that would almost be high for a 10 by today's standards, or for anybody's standards. And I think it's really interesting because it's similar to the sort of John Bonham concept of tuning, of taking big drums and tuning them higher, and that actually projects, and not even projects, but it sits in the band mix better than smaller toms tuned lower. Which, Steve Gadd and Dave Weckl, Vinny, guys like that pioneered, Steve Jordan as well, pioneered small toms tuned low in kind of a fusion setting. But Rush is louder. Rock is louder than most fusion. Most rock, Rush are loud, and Neil hits hard. He hit very hard. And bigger drums tuned higher sit in the mix, to my ears, better than smaller drums tuned lower in a situation like this. So, there are exceptions to that. Like Danny Carey plays very little toms. He's using an 8 and a 10 as his rack toms for a long time. And he figured out a way to make them work, although he was using I remember seeing in Modern Drummer that he had super, super thick shells for the 8 and the 10 to give them the sort of power to project and sit in the mix in that way. But yeah, that was a thing that I've always loved about Neil, is the tuning of the toms and the way that he hit really hard, and the way that combination, it's unusual to go to a rock concert and be able to hear every single thing the drummer was doing articulated very, very cleanly through in a balance mixed with loud guitars and loud bass. But I always heard that at Rush concerts. It's a good time actually to bring up, out of the many, many, many times that I saw them. I remember going to see them in April of '94 at the Meadowlands in New Jersey, and on the Counterparts tour. And I'd seen them a couple of times on that tour already, and I kind of got last minute tickets to see him at the Meadowlands. And I happened to get tickets. They were considered probably pretty bad seats, but if you think about an arena, if this was the stage, my iPhone was the stage, and the seats go back like this and sort of around. I had a seat on Alex's side, right on the side of the stage, basically. And there weren't really a lot of people taking up the seats here, so I moved kind of even closer and kind of further around to the back. So I had a view basically of Neil kind of from the side like this, and just a little bit above. And I was really close, and I was under the PA system. So I could actually hear his sound on stage. I was actually hearing the acoustic drum sound as well as the PA. And being that close to him, I could not believe how hard he hit. Virtually every snare drum backbeat, he was bringing the stick back. It's like the end of the stick is beyond his head. Like it's this far back. Every single one for 2 hours. And every one of those tom fills, everything was articulated because he was really hitting hard. He was a really, really powerful drummer. And that's not to say that loud drummers are better or hitting hard is the answer. But in a band like that and in a setting like that, it really, really worked. it really led to an incredibly powerful sound, an incredible amount of energy and forward motion in the music. I think because of the power that he was putting into every note and the commitment he was putting into every note. And you could hear, when you were that close, you could hear the acoustic sound of the drums and the air that they were moving even above the PA system. And that was really influential to me. I never played rock quite that hard. I never had the stamina to do it the way that he did, really. But it was still very a powerful moment to see that up close, to witness that. Other people said that who got to see him, you know, like people who got to stand right next to him while he was playing, said, like, I cannot believe how powerful a drummer he was.
Was he playing Tama or Ludwig at this point?
That was Ludwig. Yeah. That was, he switched to Ludwig. Actually, the thing we just heard, Lock and Key, he switched to Ludwig right before the Hold Your Fire album. And the sound really changed a lot. It got brighter. His sound got brighter. It's sort of brighter and woodier at the same time. It's sort of hard to explain, but the Ludwigs were pretty, they were maple and poplar. They were pretty thick shells, even though it was a 4-ply shell. It was 4 really thick plies. So they were kind of resonant, but they were strong. You know, it was probably not unlike the Yamaha Maple Custom sound. You know, Maple Customs were thick maple shells. And that was just a particular vibe. And, you know, for Neil, clear heads, double ply heads like clear Emperors usually. And again, hitting the drums very hard. That's where that sound comes from. And the next tune actually is War Paint. This is for Presto. This one's really interesting to me. This isn't a particularly challenging part, but I think this is one of his most brilliant drum parts, beginning to end. There's so much going on in this tune. And one thing to notice is this is one of those with a verse 1 and a verse 2 that are, it's actually the exact same part, right? But in verse 1, he does it playing the hi-hat and the high toms, the 6, 8, and 10-inch toms up above his hi-hat. And then in verse 2, he plays the exact same rhythm, but on the ride cymbal and on the 2 lowest toms. But it's virtually the same part. And it's so cool that he's like, okay, I'm going to come up with a part, and I'm going to come up with 2 completely different ways to use it. It's the same rhythms and the same voicing, but different voices of the kit, I guess. And then there's also a chorus where it goes into halftime, and he plays really interesting fills in chorus 1, chorus 2 that are, I think, him trying to play jazz fills. Like, I think he had it in mind, like, this section's open, I'm going to try to play some sort of jazzy influence fills. And they really are. They're kind of interesting for him. Both choruses have pretty unique fills that I think you'll recognize as kind of having some relationship to jazz language. In fact, actually, at one point he plays the Roy Haynes "Did It and Did It and Did It" fill.
Really?
Did it rhythm. Yeah. And then when he's not doing that, the other sections of the tune have this really kind of mundane, like just basic sort of Ramones like punk rock beat, just like dun dun gung 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 gung. So all of that stuff's happening. It's really crazy. And then after the second chorus, we'll keep listening into the third verse. He plays these amazing Keith Moon inspired fills. So there's so much going on in this tune. And this is another one I think is probably overlooked by most Rush or most Neil fans, but I think there's so much stuff going on in this tune that's interesting for drummers.
All right, let's start from the beginning.
Child, because see what we want to see. To the beautiful and the wise. The mirror always lies. The mirror always lies.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
man. I've listened to that song, I don't know, 1,000 times in my lifetime, but
Yeah.
never with that kind of scrutiny. There's so much happening.
Yeah, right. It's like there's there really is. It's not just one. It's not like Red Lenses where there's that one beat that we talk about. There's so many different things happening. It's really kind of chock full of interesting drum stuff, and it's a great song too. There's a fantastic guitar solo, great melody, but there's just so much thought put in. Just the idea of like coming up with that verse pattern and then reversing it on the second verse, playing the exact same pattern but on a completely different part of the kit. I just think is a really cool way of developing a tune and putting thought into a tune, and he was everything was composed, everything like this was thought out, and he'd conceptualize, okay, I'm going to do this and how am I going to do this, and I'm going to get this. And there are other musicians that they're jazz musicians or other improvising musicians that can come to these sort of conclusions and come up with these kind of parts on the fly, and that's cool too. It's possible to do both, and I think that there are certain songs that I play as a jazz musician where I try to improvise sometimes with this kind of logic, where you're playing, I don't know, I guess like soloing over the form of a standard and trying to come up with a development on the spot and trying to find, okay, here's a rhythm. I'm going to maybe base the solo around this rhythm. And then for the bridge, I'm going to do something different, but then maybe go back to this rhythm, but orchestrate it differently. I tend to improvise, not all the time. Sometimes I just let whatever come out. But other times I try to develop while I'm improvising. I try to have that same sort of sense of development over the course of a solo. And, it's a similar approach maybe in a way. And maybe for me, it comes from my love of the way that Neil orchestrated these sort of songs.
Well, we've come to the last tune, Animate.
So this ties into what I was saying about seeing Neil in '94, because this record, I think, is the only record where his live sound was really captured in the studio. And I think this would be the closest that you would find to, like, if you were standing in front of the guy in a room listening to him play drums, this is the closest you'd have to that experience. And you hear it in the intro particularly. So let's listen to that first.
All right, here's the intro. What a sound. That is such the 90s to me. It sounds like
it is
Soundgarden or Van Halen totally. Of that time period.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of that stuff was inspired and informed by Nevermind. Nirvana had hit so big in '91, and this was recorded just a couple years after that. And I think that super upfront drum sound, super thick drum sound, and big guitars, but everything kind of having its own space, stuff not really sharing sonic space, every instrument having its own sort of lane in the sonics, I think was a big influence on a lot of bands at that time, and certainly on Rush at the time. I also wanted to talk about the middle section of the tune, where it's this sort of like very Pearl Jam, Soundgarden-y influenced feel, this sort of Seattle kind of influence sound, and then it goes into something completely different, where Neil is now in this breakdown. He's playing more of a sort of African influence pattern on the toms, but very sparse, with a left foot triggering a tambourine sound. And let's just listen to it. But this also leads into, I know we're getting off the topic of drumming, but I personally think this is one of the greatest Alex Lifeson solos. This solo like just makes me shiver. I think it is such a great solo. So let's listen to that section. I think I gave you the timing through the guitar solo.
Yep, starting at 3:10.
Complicate me, elevate my counterpart, my foolish heart, man must learn to rule his tender part. A warming trend, gentle friend, man must build a fortress to a secret pace, a touch of grace. Man must learn to give a little space. A peaceful state, submissive trait. A man must learn to gently dominate.
Of
All right,
course.
guys, here we go.
Yeah. All right, we need something to lead us back into the chorus. I know what to do.
I'll hit everything.
Brilliant. Yeah, right. But yeah, I love that section. I after the guitar solo and Neil's just playing a straight ahead beat, I feel like that's what they would sound like if you heard them in a room. You know, like nothing fancy, just like here's three guys playing a rock tune. And I love that about this tune. And I love that he keeps the left foot on the tambourine thing going through the guitar solo that sort of ties that sort of West African-ish section into the guitar solo. It's a completely different sort of thing, but he keeps it consistent. He ties the two sections together, I think, by keeping the tambourine thing consistent.
Yeah.
Also, I think maybe the thing that Geddy's playing under that sparse tom-tom beat is maybe a bit related to the kind of things Adam Clayton might have played with U2. That sort of rhythmic 16th note bass sort of feeling with accents is a little bit like the kind of things it somehow just reminds me of that. I don't know if that's just anything that they had listened to at the time, but yeah, there's interesting influences on this.
I love that he left space for the bass to become the rhythm.
Yeah, that's
really
right.
cool.
That's right. Yeah. Neil is kind of playing accompaniment to the bass, taking over the groove. That's a very good point. I didn't think of that.
Man, what a cool record. Yeah, we have to end it now, but man, we've got a lot to listen to. And this is an era of records. I mean, I know Counterparts, I know Presto. Those three before that, I really don't know. So I can't believe I've got so much music to listen to. Yeah,
we didn't do anything on Power Windows, but that's an amazing record too. Is fantastic writing on that record. There's some really, really lovely tunes and amazing drumming and a really, again, one of his best drum sounds. I think that's actually his best recorded drum sound of the Tama era. The drums they're just very upfront and well recorded, and they have, again, a great place in the mix. You can really hear a lot of what he's doing, but he's also utilizing a lot of electronics. There's a lot of creative uses of, sampling, triggering sort of, this is when he started sampling African drums and tabla and things like that. and utilizing them in prog rock beats, which is, I mean, that's just cool.
Very cool. Well, everyone, get yourself a playlist of Neil. Go for a jog.
Yeah, it's good. It's good energy for it's good energy music for running. I don't run to any tempos. I as a drummer, I can keep my tempo no matter what the tempo of the music is, which is kind of what we have to do as drummers anyway, right? That's kind of our job, is we keep going steadily and other people are doing whatever they're doing. So, yeah, but it's, other than the tempos, I think it's great running music just because of the energy of it.
Right on. Well, thanks so much. So we'll see you in person here with Tom and Dave in a future episode here. So
I can't wait. Yeah. Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be on the podcast. I'm such a big fan, and it's nice to get to do this with you.
Right on. See you soon. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, man.
And that is it for this week's episode. If you like the show, please head over to iTunes or Spotify or YouTube. Make sure you're subscribing to our YouTube channel. Give us a 5-star rating. If you don't mind typing some words in to give us a review, that will help spread the word. It does actually make this show rank higher if someone searches for drums or drum podcasts or anything like that. Anyway, thanks again for your support, and we will see you next week.